بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله أما بعد. Your Excellencies, the Governors of the IDB Board of Governors, His Excellency the President of IDB, Dr. Bandar Hajjar, the Vice Presidents of IDB, the CEOs of IDB, members of the Executive Directors, the youth who have been the subject of this annual meeting, staff, colleagues, and friends, we welcome you to the 2017 IDB Governors Forum. Before we go into the program, I would like to invite Sheikh Isa Ghallis to please read some ayahs from the Quran. Sheikh Isa Ghallis.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الرحمن علم القرآن خلق الإنسان علمه البيان. الشمس والقمر بحسبان والنجم والشجر يسجدان والسماء رفعها ووضع الميزان ألا تطغوا في الميزان وأقيموا الوزن بالقسط ولا تخسروا الميزان. والأرض وضعها للأنام فيها فاكهة والنخل ذات الأكمام والحب ذو العصف والريحان فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان. خلق الإنسان من صلصال كالفخار وخلق الجان من مارج من نار فبأي آلاء ربكما تكذبان.
Sadaqallahu al-Azim, and thank you very much for this beautiful recitation. Now, there is simultaneous interpretation for this event in Arabic, and English, and French. So feel free to please utilize any of these facilities available. In addition to that, this event is being shown live. There is a live cast of the event, and we would also like to encourage the participants to please tweet the proceedings as they go on. The hashtag for the event is ISDBG42AM. There are cards that have already been distributed going around. Please utilize them to share your stories about the Governors Forum. I would like now to have the pleasure to invite the President of the Islamic Development Bank, Dr. Bandar Hajjar, to come and give the opening remarks. Please, a warm welcome for Dr. Bandar Hajjar.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. معالي محمد شمشك نائب رئيس الوزراء التركي للشؤون الاقتصادية والمالية ومحافظ البنك الإسلامي للتنمية عن تركيا. معالي سيري مولياني أندرواتي وزيرة المالية ومحافظ البنك الإسلامي للتنمية عن أندونيسيا. سعادة كافندو إمبروز المدير العام للتعاون في وزارة الاقتصاد والمالية والتنمية في بوركينا فاسو، سعادة جيلبير فوسون هونبو رئيس الصندوق الدولي للتنمية الزراعية، معالي السيد كوليابالي وزيرة الاقتصاد في بوركينا فاسو، معالي محافظي البنك الإسلامي للتنمية، ضيوفنا الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اسمحوا لي في البداية أن أعبر لكم عن أسمى عبارات الشكر والامتنان لقبولكم دعوتنا وتشريفنا هذا المنتدى النوعي في شكله ومضمونه، وهو منتدى سنوي أردناه أن يكون منصة للحوار وتبادل الأفكار حول قضايا التنمية في دولنا الأعضاء. وتم اختيار محور آفاق واعدة إطلاق إمكانات الشباب لمنتدى هذا العام، ويندرج في المحور العام اجتماعنا السنوي لهذه السنة، وهو التمكين الاقتصادي للشباب، والذي نظمته خلال القمة الأولى للشباب بمشاركة الشباب من كل دولنا الأعضاء. وقد أوضحت في كلمتي في حفل الافتتاح الرسمي بالأمس بأن مجموعة البنك تعطي أولوية لقضايا الشباب، وستتبنى المجموعة العديد من المشاريع التنموية الموجهة لهم بما يتوافق مع دور الشباب المحوري في صناعة مستقبل واعد لدولنا الأعضاء. موضوع اندماج الشباب والمرأة في عملية التنمية سيحظى إن شاء الله بأولوية في السنوات القادمة. الإخوة والأخوات، إن حيوية تطلعات الشباب تمثلان الدفع الأساسي للنهوض والتطور لأي مجتمع، كما أن التغيير في وسائل ونمط الإنتاج يستوجب قدرة هائلة على التأقلم لا يمتلكها إلا شباب متعلم وطموح. وبالرغم من الجهود المضنية التي تبذلها دولنا الأعضاء لإعطاء الشباب المكانة التي يستحقها وتمكينه من المشاركة في إدارة البناء والتطوير، إلا أنه لا يزال أمامنا طريق طويل للاستفادة المثلى من الطاقة الخلاقة والمبدعة للشباب. فلا مجال لتحقيق الازدهار في سلم الحضارة الإنسانية دون تطوير برامج مؤسساتنا التعليمية وتوجه الجامعات ومراكز التدريب لاقتصاد المعرفة وخلق فرص للعمل المنتج من خلال تمكين الشباب وإدماجهم قولاً وفعلاً في كل مناحي الحياة. إننا في مجموعة البنك الإسلامي للتنمية نتطلع بكل اهتمام إلى ما سينتج عنه اجتماعكم هذا من أفكار ورؤى تضيف لمسيرة البنك المباركة، ونؤكد على التزام المجموعة بترجمة توصياتكم إلى برامج وخطط فعالة بإذن الله. وفقكم الله لما فيه خير أمتنا، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bandar Hajjar, the President of the Islamic Development Bank, Brooke, for these inspiring words. One of the famous quotations that were given about youth was by Herbert Hoover, the former President of the United States. And I quote, "Older men declare war, but it's the youth that must fight and die." The good thing is, in the last 4 days, the youth have been fighting to die for education, for entrepreneurship, for youth development, and for the future of the Muslim world. I would like to seize this opportunity to invite the keynote speaker, the Deputy Prime Minister of Turkey, Mr. Simsek, to the high table.
President of Islamic Development Bank, Dr. Bandar Hajjar, Minister colleagues, governors, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to congratulate IDB for choosing such a topical, such a timely subject for this panel, because there are hundreds of millions of youth in our parts of the world that are neither in employment nor in education or training. This is such a huge opportunity cost for all of us. We're lucky in some sense because most OIC members actually enjoyed a demographic boom. That's the good news, meaning demographics is extremely favorable in most countries. But of course, if you can't utilize labor, if you can't utilize that demographics, that could be also a liability. And of course, there is risk of radicalization if you can't really make use of this huge resource. Now, what makes our job even more challenging is the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution. According to a study, today's primary school students will work, 2/3 of them will work in jobs that currently do not exist. I was in Davos early this year, and one of the leading, let's say, company CEO said that, by the end of this, century, that actually most of today's jobs won't exist. Professions won't exist. When I was looking for some kind of numbers for this topic, I came across a McKinsey report, which was specific to Asia. But numbers are mind-boggling, so I just wanted to share numbers. These are only specific for Asia. The report says there are 220 million youth, as I said at the beginning, that are not in education, employment, or training. 36 million unemployed, but 300 million underemployed, largely probably because of lack of necessary skills. And 180 million youth in kind of like extreme poverty. These are big numbers, but I'm sure the picture in the Middle East, North Africa, is probably no different. And that's why this is such an important topic for Islamic Development Bank to be talking about, to be doing brainstorming in the current session. Now, some of our countries are not as lucky on demographics, but some cannot just rely on cheap labor to achieve higher prosperity, and that's where productivity comes in, and that's where, again, youth come in. I think we need education. That's the first to begin with, and that's what the Islamic Development Bank, framework paper suggests. A universal education for everyone, basic skills in literacy and numeracy. I think equity in education is also critical. Labor participation, female labor participation, is largely associated with level of education. I can tell you that for Turkey. If you take, primary school graduate women in Turkey, labor participation rate is barely 20%. But if you take university graduates, it's actually well over 70%. So that's also critical. Of course, education for poor, education for ethnic groups. So, and life learning centers. Now, education, what sort of education? Clearly, the biggest problem usually is skills mismatch. Industry needs a set of skills, but educational providers don't seem to be catered for that. And that's a huge issue. And that's also key to productivity, because if you have the right skills, you tend to be a lot more productive. And at entry level, there's been a lot of studies. Most vacancies are associated with lack of skills. So this is a huge, again, opportunity cost and something that we need to work on. How do we address that? Of course, I'm going to come back to that, but I think vocational training technical schools are absolutely key. The other one is, so we have education, employment. Employment is to do with skills, the right level of skills, but also labor market reform is going to be absolutely critical. Allowing part-time work, making it flexible, is essential for youth, for them to gain the experience, but also to be able to find first jobs. The other issue is, of course, engagement of youth. If you look at societies that have achieved better state of well-being or cohesion, you tend to see better results in engaging youth in issues. That's where volunteerism comes in. That's where citizen participation comes in. That's where I think curriculum at universities or technical schools that actually encourage these issues come in. Now, let me just say a few things on Turkey. We're currently spending 24% of our tax revenues on education. So we're spending per student, we have a younger population, almost at par or the amount of money we spend on education as a percent of GDP is actually at OECD average. But the quality is an issue. We lag behind OECD averages. And that's where teachers comes in. So that's why we are very strongly focused on retraining teachers, making sure that teachers provide better education. Having competition between private and public sector is absolutely key. My government is actually paying the same money to private schools to educate individuals. So whatever we spend on public sector schools per student, we pay the same amount to private sector if they establish schools and provide better quality education. I think competition is absolutely key. Solving skills mismatch. I think we need industry, government, and education providers to work together. That's absolutely key. Collaboration is essential. Youth employment, of course, is also encouraged in Turkey. We tell employers, we say, if you hire a newcomer to job market, we'll pay 1 full year's salary. That's a minimum wage, but we pay full year salary. So you get free, essentially, workforce. Now, youth entrepreneurship is another key area that needs to be encouraged. According to a World Bank study, 70% of all jobs are created by SMEs. Now, that means we need to work on that area. Access to finance is critical, and providing grants, tax breaks to new starters, in particular those new businesses by youth, is critical. That's why in Turkey we give 3-year complete tax break for new businesses set up by youth. We also give them grants, if they're farmers or if they're in other businesses, ranging from, roughly speaking, $10,000 to $15,000 to begin with, like seed money. Access to finance, as I said, is a critical issue. We provide businesses run by youth. We have a new loan guarantee scheme, and Treasury provides the collateral for access to finance. Engagement, as I said, I think we should understand what youth wants. The new generation, the current generation, Generation Y, I think they're very different than us. We should listen to them more, and I think that would be the starting point to get them to be engaged more in issues. In Turkey, we're lucky. I think youth is pretty strongly engaged in politics and other areas. Every political party has a youth branch, and millions of them are members. Extracurricular activities is important. As I said, volunteer is important. On the top down, I think investment climate is key, and that's my final statement. There is plenty of money out there. Actually, there's plenty of money in our members. But let's look at it globally. We were at the IMF World Bank meetings. There is about roughly $24 trillion of money sitting on low-yielding government papers. There is $8.5 trillion sitting in negative yielding government papers. And there's another $8 trillion in cash on company balance sheets. Here you are. You've got $40 trillion that could easily, if you could provide the right environment, investment climate, predictability, then you could lure at least some of that money. So there's plenty of money out there. Some of our members are having to export capital. They have no choice. GCC countries are having to export capital. So it's our job to make sure that we put our house in order so that we can provide better prospects for youth, so that youth can become the engine of prosperity. Thank you very much. Once again, congratulations.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, the Deputy Prime Minister, for these inspiring words. It's really inspiring, especially the recommendation on education. One of the famous saying is that if you think education is expensive, then try ignorance. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister. I would like now to invite the panelists to the high table, starting from the Minister of Finance of the Republic of Indonesia, Her Excellency, Ms. Sri Mulyani Indrawati. Please, a warm welcome. I would also like to invite the Minister of Finance of Burkina Faso, Mrs. Hadizatu Coulibaly. Next on our panel is His Excellency Imad Najib Fakhri, Minister of Planning and International Cooperation from the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Last but not the least is His Excellency Gilbert Fasun Humbo, the former Prime Minister of Togo and the new head of the FAO. As I said, last but not the least, and finally, as you know, this event was organized jointly with the Chief Economist Complex of IDB in partnership with CNN International. And we would like to thank CNN International for being part of this. And I would like to seize this opportunity to introduce our moderator, who has just won an award in Qatar for being one of the leading journalists in reporting on energy. I would like to call the Emerging Markets Editor of CNN International, Mr. John Defterios, to lead us through the panel discussion.
Thanks for your generous comments. It's good to see you. Good. Just one opening statement before I sit down. First, I'd like to thank Jamil and the entire communications team, but particularly Dr. Bandar Hajar for inviting us back as CNN and CNN Money to the Islamic Development Bank. It feels like Jakarta was 3 or 4 years ago, and it was only a year ago. So much has transpired in the last year. Time seems very compressed, and it's great to be back here. I think it's very important for us, and I'm sure the panel agrees, if we look at the title of the Islamic Development Bank Annual Governors Forum today, it's Youth Economic Empowerment. And I'm really pleased the fact that we've decided to home in on it in 2017. As one of the roles I have at CNN is the host of Marketplace Middle East, and I've had the great honor of interviewing 3 of the panelists in the past for that program. Not just looking at youth unemployment in the Middle East, North Africa, which is, by any account, a crisis, but looking at the broader Islamic world and looking at the glass half full as opposed to half empty. And what I mean by that, the tradition was to always look to the outside world for funding. And I think His Excellency, the Deputy Prime Minister, touched upon this, when in fact we could be looking within our own community and to invest across borders. And I think the last 5 years have been incredibly solid in that area. There's been a sea change in that. And I think even putting the issue of youth empowerment and not just addressing the problem, but looking at the solution is a great leap forward. So I congratulate the Islamic Development Bank for doing so. I think we have a steep hill to climb. There's no doubt about it. His Excellency talked about the numbers of those who are not working or not in a training program or not even in education. But the sheer numbers themselves are very difficult to wrap our arms around. 300 million youth in the Islamic world today under the age of 24, growing to 340 million by the end of 2020. So the birth rate is very strong, but that's an opportunity at the same time if, as the Deputy Prime Minister was suggesting in his opening remarks, we calibrate what we're doing in the schools and outside in the workplace today. And I don't want to steal the thunder of our youth for tomorrow, but they're going to be coming out with a communique, and I've seen an early draft, if you will. And DPM, I think you'd be very pleased to know all the touch points that you brought up in your remarks very eloquently were also brought up by our youth, and they're going to present it to the governors tomorrow. Education matching what's needed in the workplace. Permanent voice within the Islamic Development Bank community and other international governmental organizations and NGOs. The climate for the entrepreneur community. Are the business conditions in the Islamic world always what they should be to encourage job creations, accelerators, and incubators that go along with it? The role in government for youth. We always used to think that those who are senior have the best ideas for the future. Let me tell you, the youth, and I have children that are 11 and 15, have a very different vision of the future than we do, as His Excellency was suggesting. And not to overlook this major hurdle for them in the past, they've been in silos in their own countries before because of the lack of cross-border trade. They're begging for social networking and, very importantly, education networking, leading, of course, to business networking in the future. I think that's a pretty good outline for our next 75 minutes together. In the spirit of the Islamic Development Bank, and as we did at the Governors Forum in Jakarta, I'm going to ask some questions. It's an open forum for these esteemed panel to talk amongst themselves, challenge each other, share ideas of what's been done correctly over the past, but also we want to hear from those in the audience with their questions. Not huge statements, not 2-minute questions, but real direct questions so we can get to solutions. And we want to hear the voices of the youth. So I see a number of different voices in the audience. You have a chance to present the communique tomorrow, but let's pose the questions tonight. How's that? Let's first bring up the issue, and I'm really pleased that the audio team has this well under control. Since it is indeed, let's start with Her Excellency, the Minister from Indonesia, the number one priority of the youth that's here attending in Jeddah for 2017, what are we doing about education to realistically close the gap? And what I mean here is, what's being taught? Is it too much memorization? And as the DPM was suggesting, not matching the skill sets for the jobs even of tomorrow, because there's compression of time change really taking place. Please.
Well, first, of course, on behalf of Indonesia, I would like to congratulate IDB for really addressing this issue of youth and their potential, but also at the same time challenge. I think talking about the education and how to really close the gap between what is the content of the education and what is really needed in the labor market in this case is something which puzzling, but at the same time, there is a solution on that. Many of the initiative of trying to match the education for employment. This is something which is actually has been experimented. I was in the bank before, so there is an IFC and talking with all the member country, discussing and designing how the vocational training, which the Deputy Prime Minister Simseks mentioned earlier. Vocational training has become then generic word, and I'm worried about that because even in Indonesia, we spend 20% of our budget for education. So it's the same similar problem with Turkey. It's not about money now, we worry about the quality. And then we look at the trainer that is teacher. The teacher has both the textbook as well as the approach of teaching, which is not yet updated with first the generation that they teach, in this case, and what is going to be the future of job, which is going to be created, not yet what we prepare now maybe is going to be destroyed, that job, and the new job that will be created in this industrial revolution has not been identified. But a couple of very important elements that is actually still continue will be relevant. Critical thinking. do we have a teacher who actually can challenge and provide a classroom with a discussion of critical thinking so that they, especially the millennial, the generation Y, that they are going to then think themselves about what is going to be the future like. You have 2 children at 11, 12. They have their own idea about what the future. Creativity. That is also another thing on not critical thinking, but creativity. That means the classroom teaching is no longer a traditional classroom teaching. So whether the teacher can adjust with this kind of new environment that they have to create. Collaboration. I mean, we are thinking about collaboration in terms of the organization, how they can engage each other and they can organize. But today, when you are talking about collaboration and networking, it can be global. They can connect it. One of the example of the small youth organization in Indonesia, which I actually watched in the TV, that they actually connected with one idea in the United States when they are actually having a championship of a new idea of design. And this is just the people who can even speak English. They're using Google Translation and then translated what is actually being the race of this design. And then they design it and they send it and they won. So this kind of what you call it networking collaboration is no longer within one village, one city, but can be in a global level.
Let me follow up on that, if I may, and I want to be direct as possible. Seeing that today is, you have a population of better than 300 million people.
It will, yeah.
Yes, you're fast approaching that number. It's not easy to move the ship and put in new standards and get the previous generation of teachers to match the jobs of the future. So let's start there with the rest of the panel, but what are you finding in terms of how long does an overhaul take on education?
The reform of the teacher is very critical. First, the education of the teacher itself. To be honest, my parent is actually the professor who's actually teaching for the future teacher. And my late parent. So they've already identified this is going to be a problem because in Indonesia before this, the government commitment to spend 20% of the budget, the appetite to become a teacher has become just residual. Usually all the bright and the brightest, they are going to take the medical school, engineering school, and so on, but not as a teacher. Today, because of the improvement of the salary, there is a growing interest, so that at least you can have a good intake. But the teacher training is very critical. And to be honest with you, in this case, the thinking about whether you are going to have a traditional teacher training or you are going to shift it into vocational practical is something which is still debated. You are talking about in Indonesia, in this case, the almost 1 million teacher in Indonesia, which is going to be retrained for what you call it general school. And in Indonesia, the education system is actually also a responsibility of the Minister of Religious. And in Indonesia, this is something that is going to be the secular traditional school and the religious school system that really need to be designed in a way that they are not going to create a different quality of labor. Because at the end, they are the same youth, right?
Right, very good. Let me bring in Minister Imad Fakhuri. You have the benefit, if you will, of a smaller population, although there's been strains in your neighborhood, shall we say, with Syria, your doorstep Iraq, the absorption of refugees at a record pace for Jordan. But you've had the ability to cherry pick some of the best practices in the world and put them into action because you've got a smaller population. And in my mind, in listening to what the minister suggested from Indonesia, there is a good model for technical training in Germany. And then you think of the higher education model in Singapore that seems to work, and they're not shy on paying good government.
I almost said that, actually. When
Yeah,
you
I'm glad.
yeah,
So we're on
okay.
the same wavelength. So what are the models that we're willing to use in the Middle East and North Africa to close this gap? You have a youth unemployment problem. You're well aware of it. Nobody hides from the issue in Jordan at all, from the very top with the king as well. What's being done now to do the match that the youth are asking for and their communique they're presenting?
Thank you, John. A great pleasure again to be at the IDB annual meeting and with all of you. And I think the starting point for all of us, and obviously every country has its own specific constraints, income levels, and characteristics. But I think the issue is not the issue of best practices and what are the models we can pilot. We've been doing this 20 years. Look at the outputs across the board, whether you're the higher income G16 country like Turkey, or whether you're in the higher upper middle income or lower middle income or low income countries. All of us have challenges in quality, all of us, and that's clear. And the starting point is, I think we need to change the development model. And when I say that, you have to factor in, first, the forces of globalization, ICT and technology revolution, connectivity, and start with the youth. Their expectations are increasing. They see what is out there everywhere, and that is putting tremendous pressure on governments, on societies to elevate the performance, to do much more with less, and to deliver on that. So that's the starting point. Second, youth is not a flavor, it's not a sector. It's not just saying that this year we're going to focus and next year we switch. Youth should be the main objective of development. We are talking about 70% of the populations. If you're not going to focus on 70% of the population, I don't know what else we're going to do in terms of development policies. And youth also is a gender and women issue. Let's make sure we remember that. It's not just youth, because half the youth are women, and the challenges in development across the board for many of us, or all of us, is also the issue of women and the gender issues related to that.
In fact, we're looking at 60% youth unemployment amongst women themselves. So this is
exactly.
gender
So you can't just
bias for
say you're
sure.
going to solve the youth issue,
Right.
and not factor in the women issue in that. So business as usual, I think, is no longer valid. Doing the pilots is not sufficient because we all failed at scaling up sufficiently to deal with that. And it needs a very different paradigm model. And think of the output of all the countries in the OIC. I think the youth unemployment is double the global average. That should give you an indicator that we all have a common challenge in dealing with this situation. So where do we start? It's very much empowering youth, not symbolically, but a real empowerment of youth, politically, economically, socially. It's starting with education. And when I say education, it's really reforming the entire human resource development value chain across the board. And I'll get into that. And for us in Jordan, we are doing a very aggressive, transformative agenda that has started with a different development model. We have outlined a 10-year program, the Jordan 2025. This was done with a very different approach, which is consultative, bottom-up. Took a year and a half to consult at all levels, all regions, to come up with a vision of where do we want to go from here till 2025. It's focused very much on the way you do the development model. So we're looking at changing roles. Government at the heart of this is having to become more efficient, effective. It has to create the right macroeconomic stable environment. It has to provide basic public services, not try to pretend that it can do everything. And this is a serious issue that has to transform across all our economies. We have to look at the issue of transparency, accountability, infrastructure, and the food, water, energy nexus, because that's important for the whole development model. But in changing this mindset, the real change will occur if we see government increasing the use of public-private partnerships, if governments are bold enough to outsource to the private sector and to civil society, because this is where you show the difference, and this will all factor into improving what the youth expect and how you're investing in them and how you are training them. And the whole idea of e-government and digitization, which changes the entire platform of what government does. And that's what government has to focus on. With that, protection, of course, safety nets, regulation, antitrust, ensuring competitiveness. That is, but do not pretend that the government is going to invest, that the government is going to continue employing, and that the government is going to end up doing everything. And then,
Go ahead. Do you want to wrap?
and then you institutionalize, in real terms, the process of public-private dialogue, meaning youth have to be at the heart of being consulted in the policy design, then the policy making, in the policy implementation, and then in the evaluation of that. And you need to involve the private sector, you need to involve civil society, and this is why I'm saying it's a change in a development model, because you really have to do it very differently. It's no longer top-down, it's no longer government thinking it knows best and it plans for everywhere, every region. It's a question of decentralization, and it's a question of both top-down, but also starting with a bottom-up and real consultative approach. And finally, just a final comment on that, then you go to a massive reform in your educational area. And we have just launched a 10-year plan. And I have to say, there are no quick fixes, by the way. And if we want to be sincere to the youth, this has to change the entire model of how we do things. And this has to be done year in, year out. And we have to be rigorous about it. So in education, you have to start at the preschools and pushing that. Look at what our best private schools and universities are providing and compare that to what the public sector is providing in education, and you understand immediately where the gap is. Music, arts, critical thinking, dialogue, tolerance, how you debate, cannot be just provided in private schools and private elite schools. This has to be part of the basic curriculum of all public schools in our countries. That's the transformation I think we're looking at. Are we really teaching music in schools? Are we teaching arts? And if you go to public schools, you'll see the gaps. These are real gaps that we all face. And if we don't start to mainstream all of these things, and added to that, of course, the way we qualify and train teachers to put them into schooling, that's a critical component to that. And we look at that 90%, 80, and 70% of the output of our education is all going to academic universities rather than technical and vocational. Clearly, it's not sustainable, and this is why we have this big mismatch between the output of the educational system and the requirements of the private sector and the needs of the private sector in the market.
Okay, good. I'm going to come back on a couple of other issues. I'm going to allow in the first round to go a little bit longer, but after this, I want to just have a much more dialogue amongst each other. These are kind of your opening statements, if you will. And Minister Coulibaly, I hope I'm saying that correct. Am I pretty close? Thank you very much. You have a unique challenge because per capita income is less than $1,000. My latest research would show around $700. So some of the discussion of almost a middle-income country like Turkey, fast-growing economy like Indonesia, Jordan on the way up, probably doesn't match with you. But I see your youth unemployment is low, but so is your literacy rates at the same time. So what are the priorities now in terms of engagement with your youth if you're a low-income country, which you are?
Merci beaucoup. Je vous laisse mettre vos écouteurs. Je voudrais donc vraiment remercier la Banque islamique de développement pour avoir choisi ce thème très important. Et moi, je préfère voir le verre à moitié plein que de le voir à moitié vide. Parce que lorsqu'on parle des jeunes, et surtout en Afrique subsaharienne, on voit ceux-là qui sont dans le mouvement de déstabilisation des pays, qui vont mourir dans la mer pour traverser, etc. Je crois que nous, au Burkina Faso, et je crois que c'est comme ça que nous allons réfléchir, c'est pour cela d'ailleurs, je pense que la Banque islamique de développement a choisi ce thème, c'est de voir qu'au lieu d'être le problème, les jeunes peuvent être la solution. Et parce que, comme les statistiques l'ont montré, c'est une frange importante de la population, et le dividende démographique, c'est eux qui demain peuvent représenter en fait les facteurs de développement de nos pays. Et c'est pour cela que nous devons investir maintenant dans la jeunesse. Il y a des éléments qui sont ressortis effectivement et en matière d'éducation. Je suis tout à fait d'accord que dans le cursus de formation de nos jeunes, il faudrait que nous puissions choisir les domaines qui sont demandés par le marché. Et parce qu'on se rend compte malheureusement que nous avons des formations de généralistes, tous tournés vers l'administration publique, et ce n'est pas de ces personnes-là que nous avons besoin pour le développement de nos pays à ce stade. Actuellement, et comme nous d'ailleurs nos ressources sont rares, et nous avons pensé qu'il faut une bonne utilisation de nos ressources en ciblant des secteurs stratégiques pour le développement de nos pays et en formant les jeunes pour répondre aux besoins du marché. Ça, c'est un élément important. Le deuxième élément, et nous nous sommes rendus compte que par le passé, justement, la formation était orientée vers l'administration publique. Mais les secteurs créateurs d'emplois et de richesses, c'est bien le secteur privé. Donc notre réflexion à l'heure actuelle, comment amener les jeunes à être non seulement absorbés par le secteur privé en étant des employés, mais eux-mêmes en étant leurs propres employeurs et en créant des emplois. Je crois que c'est là le défi le plus important dans des pays comme en tout cas le mien. Et donc ce que le gouvernement a décidé de faire dans le plan national de développement économique et social couvrant la période 2016-2020, nous avons décidé d'investir dans les petites et moyennes entreprises qui sont conduites par les jeunes, qui sont dans les secteurs d'innovation, parce que les jeunes peuvent créer plus que les anciens, ils sont connectés vers le monde, ils ont des idées nouvelles, à telle enseigne que le 31 mars dernier, le gouvernement a adopté un programme de start-ups pour encourager les jeunes dans les secteurs porteurs de croissance et d'emploi, et nous comptons créer à ce niveau 10 000 emplois par an. La stratégie, c'est laquelle? Nous avons observé, et dans plusieurs pays, que par le passé, on disait financer les petites et moyennes entreprises. C'était le financement qu'on donnait. Mais autant les entreprises se créent, autant le taux de mortalité de ces entreprises est élevé. Comment faire pour que ces entreprises restent? L'État lui-même met des ressources dans les entreprises. Il prend des participations dans ces entreprises. Il assure l'encadrement de ces entreprises. Et lorsque ces entreprises marchent, l'État se retire petit à petit. Donc nous pensons que ce sont des types d'approches qu'il faut utiliser dans nos pays. Et nous avons pensé aussi, parce que pour qui ne connaît pas le Burkina Faso, c'est un pays dans lequel la jeunesse est très active, politiquement engagée. Elle a été capable de renverser un régime de 27 ans. Donc je crois que c'est des partenaires avec lesquels il faut compter. Donc nous avons des cadres pour le dialogue social avec les jeunes. Je crois que c'est un aspect très important. Parce que lorsqu'il n'y a pas de dialogue avec les jeunes, ce trop-plein d'énergie, finalement, c'est dans la rue qu'ils vont déverser ce trop-plein. Donc, nous avons besoin aussi de paix et de stabilité pour pouvoir gérer nos pays. Je voudrais aussi peut-être dire aussi qu'au niveau du gouvernement, il y a un ministère dédié à la jeunesse et à l'emploi des jeunes. Et que ce ministère est en train d'élaborer justement sa politique nationale de la jeunesse pour s'assurer que nous avons un cadre cohérent qui nous permette de répondre aux objectifs du gouvernement, qui est que sur 5 ans, nous devons porter le taux de croissance du produit intérieur brut à 7,7% en moyenne sur 5 ans. Bon, ce qui n'est pas, dans certaines contrées, c'est un peu quelque chose de difficile, mais nous déjà en 2016, après 2 années de crise, on a pu se situer à 5,9% de taux de croissance. Donc je crois que plusieurs personnes peuvent envier, je crois, le Burkina Faso pour ses performances économiques, mais je crois que c'est sur les jeunes, effectivement, qu'il faut compter pour pouvoir avancer. I will stop there and maybe wait for the second round. Thank you.
Great. I think that you've raised some phenomenal points up here in the SME sector, and I'll come back to you, of course. I'm really curious to find out in Burkina Faso what type of companies are getting started. And in fact, one of the institutes I'm involved in, which is a nonprofit for entrepreneurship, has set up 2 schools in Burkina Faso. So I'm very curious. I haven't been there yet, but I'm curious to see where the youth really want to do in terms of creating businesses as well. But I will come back. And I think it's prescient that we have the agriculture community represented on our panel, particularly the president of the International Fund for the Agricultural Development, or IFAD, Mr. Hongbo. A lot of people now think for the future, we all have talked about the knowledge-based economy. Where do we have a match with the knowledge-based economy and agriculture? I know I've done stories in the field about the amount of wastage in the farming sector, particularly in Africa, from the field getting to the market is a huge issue. What is the role, first and foremost, on employment through agriculture and some of the innovation you're trying to drive at IFAD? I would ask you to stay away from your speech and share your heartfelt thoughts here of what you're trying to accomplish, because often agriculture is overlooked, and I think it's often a mistake. Please.
Thank you so much, and let me start again by thanking IDB for inviting us to this this forum. And quickly, maybe 2 or 3 statistics that I would like to add to what the DPM for Turkey has presented. It's important to keep in mind that 80% of the youth we're talking about live in developing countries. It's also important to keep in mind that most of them are living in rural area. Another important dimension is what I believe ILO will call the working pool. 38% worldwide of the youth that are working, we're not talking about, now we are talking about the unemployed. We have to keep in mind that 38% of those that are employed still live below the poverty line, 38%, and 70% in Africa. That being said, I want to echo what Madame Coulibaly from Burkina said in terms of looking at the glass half full. Listening to the colleagues in the panel, while all countries, from high income to low income country, all have the challenge, I still believe it's important to look at it from the perspective of low income in terms of the solution forward. The challenge, the way you want to address it from a low income perspective might be a little bit different from upper middle income or high income perspective. Most of the low income countries, the contribution of agriculture to their GDP is high. It can be 30%, 35%. Whereas in upper middle income countries or high income countries, maybe that percentage is lower. Yet, those upper middle income countries still have what I would call a lot of pocket of poverty, pocket of resistance, very often in remote area. So the point we are making in IFAD is very clear that for those low-income countries where the contribution of rural setting, where 2/3 of the population live, it has to be at the center of the national development strategy to start with.
Isn't that a huge challenge today because of massive migration? We could take Indonesia, Jakarta, you could look at China in itself, Beijing and Shenzhen and the rest. Are you having difficulty putting that on the agenda for the IGOs of the world to say, let's not forget about the rural poor or the farm belts of the world? This is an issue that's been around for the last 20 years.
Yeah, but the solution has to come from that. I would like to argue that if you look at it from an agricultural perspective, the challenge that I want to recognize in terms of the training challenge that the Minister of Finance from Indonesia and the DPM raised. Yes, but in the agriculture sector, you will see that the challenge is much less because there has been a lot of experiences there that if we are able to encourage, to demonstrate to the youth that living in a rural setting, creating kind of the secondary city zone is not a punishment, but they can make a decent income by working on the rural transformation, then we can really be part of the solution as a fight against economic migration.
Very, very fascinating. Minister Indrati?
John, in this case, because many countries transform their mainly primary agriculture base to become more manufacturing and then even in the services sector. This transformation usually also accompanied by the urbanization area. So if you put within that context technology, then the future of what you call it food security will no longer need that as many labor working in agriculture area. And so the question, they are moving to the city, and then you have the poor, which is no longer a rural poor, become the urban poor. Productivity technology is very important, but in this case, is going to transform the whole labor force. And so the design of the policy of the government is how you are going to combine this technology that is going to then have the ability to crowdsource the idea Because when they are more urban-based, I'm not saying that the rural and agriculture is important in Indonesia. In fact, we are not providing a financial grant for each village so that they are going to be able to actually define and design what is the activity that is meaningful for the employment creation, as well as, and especially for women, so that it's no longer money as a constraint, but more an idea and sustainability that is going to be discussed. Now, on the transformation to the urban area, I think the youth, urban youth, is going to be something which is really creating a different dynamic from what you call it 3 decades ago, for example, in Indonesia, when we're transforming from the rural-based agriculture economy to become more manufacturing services in an urban area. They are becoming much more creative, but you can see that the social interaction is becoming very fast. Information is easily accessible, but not all information is actually useful for them. So for the young generation now, actually they really need to be equipped by how they are going to make a choice. Because many of our generation, maybe it's more the accessibility. We don't have library, we don't have an access of textbook, we don't have access of information, computer. Now maybe it's much more larger, the accessibility, but the problem will change into how they are going to choose the quality of information which is going to be useful for them, as well as useful for the society. Because you can click almost any information in the internet.
So let's drill down a little bit, because we've had different efforts in Turkey, for example, when things heated up to shut down some of the social media traffic on Twitter and the rest. What are you suggesting here, Minister? And I'll have the DPM come back into the debate here. There's too much noise out there, and it's actually distracting our youth?
You're asking me, or
yes,
you're asking
and then have the Deputy Prime Minister jump in.
I think Mehmet wants to pass it to me.
I'm just letting you warm him up to let him think about the question.
John, I mean, as a policymaker, I just actually mentioned it also in the other session. When I was finance minister 10 years ago, you can see that the feedback from society on our policy is a little bit longer in this case, because we have still traditional media. We have internet, but not as fast. And social media is not as sophisticated as today. Today, as a policymaker, even when you haven't said it, you just think about it or put it in your heart, it's already transparent. They already make us a feedback. So this is, for me, it's quite a challenge as a policymaker. When you are open, transparent, and want to be accountable, but at the same time, if you look at it in a positive side, then actually you can actually get the advantage of it. Because you can get early feedback or timely feedback of what kind of quality, and then especially as a finance minister, you care about whether the money can achieve result. With technology, you can get the feedback. On the politics side, I will leave it to Deputy Prime Minister Sinsan to say that.
I thought she was going to ease the transition for you, but she did exactly the opposite.
I help you
Very
in this
clever
case,
politician.
Yeah.
Please, what are your thoughts? Because you've had a phenomenal growth, quadrupling of the GDP, right, in 12 years. But you've hit a little bit of a ceiling here. And in that 12 years, we've had social networking pick up in an incredible way, which puts pressure on government. So how do you respond as a rising economy that wants to grow fast again?
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think we don't have a wholesale approach of, limiting social media. It's only it has to be taken within a context. Like recently, there was, Wikipedia is an open platform. There was a court order to amend a piece there, but they protected it, preventing it from being amended. So that essentially you're implementing court order, but I don't really want to go into the specifics of that. Turkish youth are strongly connected. Relative to a decade ago, we now have broadband access, almost to entire families. Even in remote villages, the government is spending money to put satellites so that the schools have access to broadband internet, because we're actually using technology to see if we could narrow the gap in terms of quality of education. So the best teachers in places like Istanbul and Ankara giving lectures so that the remote village youth and students can actually follow it up. But so we're actually employing the technology and social media, and I'm actually, quite a strong user. I mean,
Well, in fact, you have a huge following on Twitter, for example. But what the president was suggesting from the Agricultural Fund is it making a difference in rural Turkey in terms of employment in the agriculture sector? You're an agricultural powerhouse. Let's call it like it is. You're a big exporter of product. But is it starting to develop and make a difference in the rural communities when it comes to youth development, in your view?
It does, but I think, let's face it, as countries develop, agriculture employment tend to shrink. When we began this journey, my government, about a decade and a half ago, we at that time had 38% of Turkish population supposedly in agriculture, employed in agriculture. Today it's down to 20%. It's still very high because most of them were hidden unemployees, unpaid family workers. So let's put it this way. I think, technology is going to even accelerate this process. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think if you can provide services jobs, manufacturing jobs, and provide the transition, the skill, life learning like centers and skills needed to make that transition, help with that transition, which is exactly what we've been doing, then you can create jobs and manage this. I mean, since the global financial crisis, we've created 7.2 million jobs. And we are really providing strong incentives for newcomers to be employed, as I said earlier on.
You bring a great point to foster the debate. You've done that, and your unemployment rate's 13%. Youth unemployment's almost 25%.
Yes, because
so this is the challenge, right? It's the birth rates that are going to be adding to the ability to governments to respond. And that's not just a question for you, but for the rest of the panel. Please jump in.
Labor participation rate in places like Turkey is rising so fast, in particular among females, because we provided access to education. Just to give you some color, relative to a decade or a decade and a half ago, the ratio of girls to boys in primary school has gone up from like 92 to 102, so in favor of girls. In secondary school, it's gone up from 65 to 98. So women access, girl access school has gone through the roof, and that is boosting labor participation rate, but also working age populations rate. These are good trends. These are exactly what we want.
Right.
But managing
doesn't help your numbers.
Doesn't help with, yes, of course. But I think the key issue is, again, we're going back to good quality education for everyone and skills needed for employment, not today, but in the future. And of course, supporting youth employment for them to get the experience, and also support for youth entrepreneurship, which is key in terms of access to finance and tax breaks.
Okay. An open question to the panel here, and I want to allow some time for us to go to the floor as well. We have about 40 minutes left. The informal economy, I know it's an issue in Burkina Faso. You see it in Jordan, Indonesia, it's 70%, I think it is. How do we close the informal economy if we want to bring as many onto the rolls so we can track what they're doing? Do you want to start in the Burkina Faso area? And I think Minister Indrati, Imad, I'm sure it's an issue in Jordan as well. Please, Madam.
Merci beaucoup. Bon, les questions de secteur informel, effectivement, sont un secteur très important, mais nous abordons ça à deux niveaux. Nous pensons que c'est important d'aborder ça à deux niveaux. Le premier niveau, c'est l'inclusion financière. Comment nous essayons de les mettre dans le circuit de l'économie? Et donc, il y a un partenariat que nous créons avec les institutions de microfinance pour nous assurer que, étant donné que ces institutions arrivent à toucher la grande masse de la population, que le gouvernement peut travailler avec elles pour mettre à disposition certaines lignes de crédit pour pouvoir toucher les plus pauvres. Ça, c'est un aspect. Mais le deuxième élément de l'inclusion, et c'est normal, comment nous pouvons recevoir quelques revenus du secteur informel? Parce que lorsque nous parlons de financer le développement, on a ici parlé de ressources propres. Dans notre plan national de développement économique et social, nous avons prévu qu'il serait financé à 64% par des ressources propres. comment lever les ressources, comment au niveau fiscal toucher le secteur informel. Et donc nous sommes en train de travailler à l'heure actuelle, d'ailleurs avec une compagnie, bon, comme c'est broadcast, j'espère que ma stratégie ne va pas sortir, mais sérieusement parlant, nous sommes en train de voir comment le mobile banking peut être utilisé pour amener les contributeurs du secteur informel à payer leurs taxes. Je crois que ça, c'est un aspect important sur lequel, effectivement, nous sommes en train de faire un investissement et nous pensons que ça va marcher. Mais sur un autre terrain, même pas le secteur fiscal, je crois qu'il faut montrer ici comment les jeunes, justement, avec les technologies de l'information et de la communication, peuvent faire avancer nos pays. Nous avons 2 expériences récentes au Burkina Faso où un jeune a fait une découverte d'une glacière qui peut conserver les vaccins. Parce qu'en zone rurale, comme on n'a pas d'énergie, la conservation des vaccins est difficile. Ça s'appelle la FIBAG. Ils viennent de découvrir ça. Et donc, ça nous permet d'avoir une certaine autonomie pour les agents communautaires de santé. Et il y a une banque locale qui a décidé de financer le projet de ce jeune homme pour passer à l'échelle. Un deuxième exemple aussi intéressant, tout récemment, le Haut Commissariat des Nations Unies, le Haut Commissariat des réfugiés, a eu aussi à primer un Burkinabé qui a découvert ce qu'il appelle quelque chose de banal, le e-état civil. Des enfants naissent dans les campagnes, ils n'ont pas d'identité, et lorsqu'ils veulent aller à l'école ou avoir certains services sociaux, on dit, mais quel est votre acte de naissance? Même les parents ne savent pas. Et donc, à partir seulement du téléphone cellulaire, l'agent de santé peut donner l'identité de la personne, de l'enfant qui vient de naître, un garçon, une fille, etc., etc. Et donc, ça permet après à l'enfant d'avoir un acte de naissance. C'est juste pour dire que les technologies de l'information et de la communication, parce qu'on parlait aussi des médias, des social media, comme on dit, les médias sociaux, on en parlait tout à l'heure. Je crois que ce sont des aspects de la technologie qui permettent aussi à nos pays d'avancer, pas seulement qu'ils dénoncent ce que les autorités font ou ne font pas, mais c'est qu'ils permettent aussi, je crois que sur plusieurs plans de développement, de pouvoir avancer.
Very clear. Imad Fakuri, I've always been shocked by the difference between Amman pricing even and real estate because of all the cash that's come in from a number of your migrants into the country, and then the rural farmlands of Jordan, which I've always been impressed by as well because they're exporting and some of the programs on the Syrian border. I know there's an effort to bring much more of that into the formal economy. Do you find this a challenge, trying to drive economic development in rural Jordan, but at the same time make sure you can make full account of it at the same time?
I mean, informality is a symptom that needs to be addressed because you're either over-regulating or the cost of starting a business or maintaining it keeps increasing, or because there's a challenge of access to finance and things like that. So people go out primarily. And then there's an aspect related to economic migrants, refugees who work, illegally for other reasons. I don't want to touch on that, so let me just focus on that part. So the way we're dealing with this is very much comes at the heart of economic empowerment of youth. If we agree that the government has to implement a good rule of law, equal opportunity, improve the regulatory environment, I would argue that most of our countries today are over-regulating in many areas, and we need to deregulate.
That's a very radical thought, actually.
It is, and I'll tell you why. Because over the past 20 years, we have been adopting new conventions globally on environment, on the safety, on fighting this, on fighting that. So every country goes back very quickly and adopts additional layers of legislation to deal with the issue. What we don't track is the cumulative effect of how many things you end up creating and hurdles and inspections and prerequisites that you have to do before you start a business, or once you start it, how many teams come and inspect you from how many levels. So ease of doing business is critical. It's the issue of allowing home-based businesses. So that's what we're doing. So we changed legislation to start allowing home-based businesses, because a lot of the informality were people who didn't have enough money, they have a skill, they're an architect, or they're making products or food products. They can't afford to rent a space, get it licensed, start the production, and do, the basics for a small business, but they can operate out of their home. And it's so allowing the home-based business, giving discounts and exemptions on costs of starting, the fees, and all of that to start the businesses. That's very critical. And then providing the support that is needed to start up a business, from how you do a business plan, to how do you market a product, to how you design it, to how you adopt standards. If you're making a food item, then how do you do the HACCP standards so that you can sell the products without, poisoning people, or from a public safety point of view and that. It's that total then package that comes in to empower a youth, a woman to start their own business with the full system of support, with the least amount of intrusive over-regulation, and with the lowering of the costs that are needed to do that.
Very well said.
Can I
President
follow up
Mungwa.
on this?
I was going to ask you to.
Yeah, I think it's quite important. It's a very strong statement.
Bring that microphone closer to you.
It's quite a very strong statement. In some cases, at the national level, I will agree that you may need to maybe revise some of your existing regulations or laws. But we have to be mindful that in other cases, maybe it's the lack of proper policy and regulation that is also part of the problem. Certainly, what you are referring to, and I will agree with that, we need to see how do we improve the business environment, and that one you may need to deregulate in some of cases. But on the flip side, and this informality in a lot of countries in Africa and elsewhere, you cannot nowadays delink it from the migration challenge. Yeah. And if you don't look at the fight against inequality perspective, and to address the inequality, sometimes you need much more regulation to make sure that they have access to basic services. And when they go to the ministries to register the businesses, they don't get frustrated. And you need also regulation to see how. So it is on both sides that I believe we need to look at it. And I also want to make the case that when you look at both from an informal perspective, is always linked to how do we keep the youngsters maybe not necessarily in the bigger cities. The big cities will always grow because of the population growth. We address that. But what I'm saying is that with proper training, using the technology, I'm talking about rural transformation, which goes beyond purely agricultural production. It's also training the youth in better use of technology, better integrating the climate-smart agriculture, and start the transformations process in all the different value chains. And you don't need to do that in the big cities. You still can do that in the rural area.
Has that technology and the infrastructure kept pace? I'll come back to Minister Fakouri, but has it kept pace so you don't have so much wastage? Do we make it easier for people to get time to market? Is the infrastructure in that last mile making it to these people in the rural heartland?
Today, you cannot say that today the technology is at default. It's really the access to the finance. That's what I believe one of the ministers was touching upon. Is the access to the finance by the youth. So this idea about, I believe European Union are working on a program right now, this idea about being able to provide much more guarantee. And I believe the DPM from Turkey will give an example of the money they make available, I believe 10,000, if I understand very well. For example, this type of guarantee can help the youth to have much more access to the rural finance and putting their creativity at work in transforming the basic production. The technology is there. And linked to that, and I think the Minister of Indonesia was referring a bit to that, how do we link the smallholders production to the big commercial farms, to the whole food value chain today? So that linkage also, by making the access to the market, both at the sub-regional or at the regional level, is going to contribute to the solution.
You've been doing some thinking as president, I see. You're not just sitting in your office. So all these good ideas. Yeah. Minister Indarwati, and then we'll come to Minister Fakouri and to the minister as well, please. You have
I think back to
70% in the informal sector, am I right?
Yeah,
You're the
well-
reason I wanted to ask that question, because it's a huge capture in an island country.
Well, like the Jordanian statement about the cost to being informal or the barrier to become a formal is too high. And then in this case, whether this is because of the regulatory framework or all the licensing in this case. So doing business reform is very important. You are lowering the barrier that being formal is not difficult. That is the most important, because being formal, or in this case, you just open your company and by tomorrow you become formal. That is going to be a radical change in terms of the bureaucratic and policy reform. So for Indonesia, the priority of reducing the cost of doing business and the indicator investment climate has become the priority. In fact, Indonesia last year is among the top reformer because we increased and jumped on the ease of doing business by 15 rank.
By 15?
1.5.
In 1 year?
Yeah, in 1 year. That's
Wow.
really quite, we're actually surpassing big country like India and other, Philippines. So meaning that for policy to become as lower as possible, creating an obstacle for those informal sector become a formal. Or if you become formal, you are not going to be identified as difficult to comply, as mentioned, whether this is environmental, labor standard, and all other, even in this case, anti-money laundering now, and all those things, the tax payment, is all those things that create more obstacle for the informal sector. Second, and back to this discussion about the youth, I think many of the young generations want to really start up doing and establish a startup business. You know, many on the media, social media, when they're talking about who's actually their role model in terms of the business, they are talking about Uber. It's a company who has no taxi, but they are the biggest taxi transportation in the world. Airbnb is a company who's actually having all the hotel and so on, but have no property in a hotel. So now the young generation thinking, oh, I actually can create something by connecting through this technology between supply and demand. You're talking about connectivity. I think in order for you to be able to create that kind of business networking, infrastructure is non-negotiable. And that's why in Indonesia now that we are so ambitious in really developing infrastructure, because we are an island country. There's no way you are going to be able to develop all those 1,000 islands in Indonesia, not 1,000 islands like the salad dressing, but this is the real 1,000 islands of Indonesia. You cannot develop that without connecting those islands between the demand and supply. But you cannot also take it for granted, but while the connection is going to be established through this infrastructure development, then the economic immediately is going to be developed. You really have to think what need to be jumpstart the development of those. So government really think in all levels, investing in infrastructure, investing in human capital, but at the same time, you really have to be very careful whether your policy framework is creating more burden to the business. And really, to be honest with you, John, as a policymaker, the hardest part is to reform the bureaucracy. On this kind of thinking that you serve the people, you serve the business, it's not them who actually have to ask you your permission. This is the cultural shift and mind shift is going to be really big. I did it quite a lot in this, really try to change the bureaucracy. It's really step by step. A lot of leadership, role model, but really you have to use quite a lot of technology to create pressure from stakeholders to your own bureaucracy.
Right. In fact, I just conducted an interview with Minister Al-Jadaan here in Saudi Arabia, and he said in his speech to the Euromoney conference just 10 days ago, it's transparency in emerging markets that will make the difference to break down bureaucracy. I see a nodding heads here. Imad, are you finding the same thing, that technology actually introduces transparency, and it starts to tear down the legacy of bureaucracy? And we can even get the thoughts of the minister from Burkina Faso. Imad, do you want to start?
Very, very much so. And I think at the heart of this is this idea of digitizing government and e-government. E-government is about breaking down these multiple players, bureaucrats who will play with the system, block something, delay giving an approval, for other reasons. It could be administrative corruption, it could be direct corruption, it could be whatever you want to call it, and we see that. And that's why there's always resistance to even doing e-government initiatives. And it takes a very long time, because you're actually taking out the middle person, and you're allowing the citizen or the business to interact directly with government, get predictable service, no favoritism, and it's done. And that's very critical. But I wanted to touch base about some of the things we need to do. I would argue, I've been in development for a long time, and we are always trying to reform the bureaucracy to change the way it works. And I think that's too slow, and it's taking too much time. And I'm having that challenge also within the context that I'm working in. I would argue that the more we can, if you want to leap in this, outsource to the private sector, pull the government back, outsource more, use PPPs more, you will have better impact. My worry is if we want to change the way the bureaucracy deals with this, that's a very long-term process. It takes time. And I think the challenge and the threat we have of this huge youth bulge, which has huge expectations, they're increasing day by day, and we are not even able as governments to predict the type of jobs that are out there, then the way you do this is you change the model, pull back, create the right regulatory environment, and let the private sector lead, and also let the individuals lead. And what we're doing there is in 9th, 10th, 11th grade now, we're introducing for the first time entrepreneurial classes, how to start a business, how to do that. That was non-existing. We're actually teaching something that used to be sinful, that it's okay to start a business and fail. Failure is part of the learning process. That's, I think, new to many of the cultures and the countries we deal with. You don't change if you don't teach failure, and that failure is part of the success and that learning curve, we're not going to transform the society significantly. And you need to launch innovative fund, startup funds, technology funds, and we're doing that all across and scale them up.
Changed, I think,
and it's not just the financing, it's the financing that comes then. It's not only access to financing, it's access to financing and all the services you need to bring in to help start that. And it's the self-employment initiatives that are going to fill a big part of the economic empowerment you need. The government is not going to be able to employ of that. Also, the private sector is not going to be able to employ all of those people. It's the third part, which is the self-employment initiatives that are going also to complement. It's these three things coming together that will make the difference and will change that. And today with technology and the portals, so in Jordan we did a portal called Furas, Opportunities. And it's a platform where the youth tap into, and it tells them, to do actually psychometric exams to figure out what they want to do in life. It tells them how to volunteer, to build up their CV starting from 6th and 7th and 8th grade. It tells them all the soft skills. Where can they get the training? Some online, some in different institutions and organizations. It tells them, how do I start my personal project? How do you finance it? How do you register it? Who can help me? Who can provide the funds for that? And so on. And it also does the matchmaking. Where can I find a job? How can I put my CV? And it links everybody electronically. I don't need to go to every house to do that or to send these awareness campaigns. But you give the platforms, you do still the awareness campaign, and it's using that type of technology to create the self-employment opportunities. You do the ease of doing business and that. And one final thing that relates to that, stop thinking of sectors, think of clusters with the backward and forward linkages. So you don't think of agriculture just as planting in rural areas. You think about the whole food industry value chain, and then you can address the challenges that we were discussing before.
Okay, good. I think this is a good time. I'm going to come back to the minister with a final thought here. Can we have the microphones? I just wanted to make sure we have the audience microphones, so we can have one closer to the room, to the front here. The handheld mics, we have a mic question there. Can I see the microphones, please? We have another one here. The handheld mics, please. Thanks. Minister, do you want to finish your thoughts? And I'm going to go to the floor. Very quickly, if you could, please.
Oui, merci beaucoup. Je voudrais peut-être, comme le président de IFAD avait posé la question sur le lien entre les petits et les grands, je voulais dire que nous avons un agropole et qui s'occupe des questions d'agriculture dans une région. Et ça s'appelle Bagré, le Bagré Pôle, ça s'appelle comme ça. C'est un grand barrage qui a été construit. Et dans le modèle économique qui a été développé, c'est de faire justement exister l'agriculture familiale et l'agriculture privée des petites, moyennes et plus grandes entreprises s'il le faut. L'avantage, c'est quoi? On s'est rendu compte d'abord que la productivité des petits entrepreneurs qui ont été installés, leur agriculture, la productivité a été multipliée par 2. Parce que justement, ils ont eu droit à l'eau, il y a les conseils techniques qui sont là, etc., etc. Et ils apprennent aussi des plus grands. Dans le modèle économique, c'est que les plus grands vont absorber une partie de la production des plus petits et aussi il y aura un transfert de technologie des plus grands aux plus petits. Donc c'est un modèle que nous sommes en train de développer, c'est un grand barrage hydro-agricole et nous espérons donc, comme le FIDA est notre partenaire dans le domaine de l'agriculture, que ce modèle pourrait peut-être servir à montrer aussi qu'on peut effectivement le formel et l'informel travailler ensemble, plus ou moins c'est ce que je voulais faire comme commentaire. Dernier élément, pendant que les gens lèvent le doigt, on s'est rendu compte justement, bon ça c'est l'histoire des pays qui ont développé les technologies de l'information et de la communication, que ça permettait de faire avancer le progrès très rapidement. Mais nous n'avions pas suffisamment d'infrastructures. La bande passante, le backbone, comme on dit, on n'avait pas ça en place. Et le gouvernement a décidé d'investir là-dessus pour que nous puissions couvrir le territoire national et nous assurer donc que les jeunes qui sont aussi dans le milieu rural peuvent accéder aux technologies de l'information et de la communication pour leur business. Voilà ce que je voulais faire comme commentaire rapidement. Merci.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of hands up. I just want to see, do we have a second microphone? Is there a second microphone? Great. I just want to get a mic into the gentleman's hand in the back row there. The second microphone. Go ahead and get the hand into his hand, please, so we can keep the questions up. Just identify yourself if you can direct the question. Jamil, I'm looking for the second microphone.
My name is...
Okay, I know, but let's get it into the hands of the people here. There's a gentleman with his hand up. Please stand up. Sir, yes, you. And get the second microphone into his hand, please.
Faisal Tahir Khan. I'm an entrepreneur and author of Developing Entrepreneur Ecosystem in Islamic World. My question is to respectable Deputy Prime Minister. You talked about the different financial facilities available in pan-Islamic world and different assets. So there is a rough, sovereign wealth fund have huge finances. Only Middle East have more than $2 trillion. Do you think sovereign wealth fund can play a pivotal and proactive role in developing the ecosystem of entrepreneurship in Islamic world, especially by being more towards angel investors and venture capitalist fund, rather investing more in mature industries and bricks and mortars and flashy deals, which we have seen lately? Thank you.
Good, very good question.
The answer is absolutely yes, because most of these sovereign wealth funds, they have flexible business models. They should have departments that serve like private equity, venture capital, even if they have sufficient experts or experienced people, they could even serve as business angels. But they have resources. And in particular, our part of the world, I'm talking about oil-rich countries, they're in desperate or in significant need of diversification. And diversification is going to be essential to creating jobs for youth. So diversification could be accelerated by sovereign wealth fund actually focusing on supporting not only high-tech startups, promising companies, but also companies that are set up by, let's say, youth. So my point is, from crowdfunding to business angels, venture capital to traditional support mechanism, I think sovereign wealth fund should be converted into an investment bank with all these different types of departments on the top of the classic asset management, which they do. So yes, the answer to your question, absolutely yes.
Quite a radical change of thought, but it's really fantastic to bring it up because it's not part of the vernacular now. We had a hand up in the back. Do you have a microphone there, sir? Just stand up. You guys have to stand up to get the mics to you. Please go ahead,
have-
and then we'll
I
get
have-
this. Just remain standing. We'll get a microphone. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, Your Excellencies. My name is Dana Madou. I am the youth delegate for Kuwait. I believe here we're talking about youth economic empowerment. And as the youth delegate for Kuwait, I have attended for the past 2 years all the discussion panels, and we also helped write the communique that we're going to present on Thursday. And my question is actually about this very topic, and I would like to address it to His Excellency Mr. Fakhouri. First of all, I would like to thank you for how honest.
Excuse me. I need you to get. Everybody's got to get straight to the question.
I will.
Because we have 20 minutes.
I will.
Yeah,
I
you don't
just,
need
I
to
just,
thank them.
I just
They're
wanted
more
to-
than willing to answer for you.
If you don't mind, I just
Yeah.
wanted to thank him for how sincere he was and how honest and to the point he was. You were saying something about that we cannot really implement some of the laws that would allow e-commerce and e-governments because of the corruption, and how this will cut the middleman. And there will be a lot of struggles because there will be faced with restraints and all of that. What I wanted to ask is, how can we change the perception in policymakers and really give them the chance to see how much is being lost, how many opportunities are being lost because they cannot really see potential in certain ideas. What can we do to change the mindset of policymakers and educate them to really recognize potential in certain ideas and certain businesses from entrepreneurs?
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and very briefly. I think if policymakers don't understand that they have to all have this early warning system, this is going to blow up in our faces all across our countries. This is not something that's going to stand and wait and be patient, because it's about the livelihood of 70% of your population and so on. So very, very, very quickly, it's, as I said, you have to change the development model. It has to be a real consultative process. You have to engage the youth in determining the needs first by themselves, and then have the dialogue there, and then involve them in the policy design, and then the policy implementation, and so on. Second, I want to just clarify, what I meant to say is that there is a resistance to change all the time for making governments more transparent, and you see it very clearly when you try to embark on e-government and digitization initiatives, because to a large extent it is cutting the middle person, it's lowering the levels of the layers of bureaucracy. Before you enable an e-service, you actually have to map it. You look at it, then you figure out, oh my God, there's 20 signatures to approve this process. Then you figure out that you need to re-engineer it, then you enable it. So by actually going through the exercise of e-government, that's a way to look out, are you over-regulating, how many layers you have, and you immediately figure out why in this sector, government officials lobby the hell out of that location to move into, and you figure out why they want to move there, and it becomes easy. It turns a light on immediately on what's in the back kitchen and in the back office to do that.
Great. We have a lot of different hands up, so we go to this gentleman and then back. You've been very patient. Thanks. Please.
Thank you. My question is related to education. Yesterday in the Youth Summit, many of the young people have expressed their complaint regarding the education systems that prepare them only for taking exams and not really for lifelong learning. So what would the panelists suggest in terms of what governments can do to solve this problem? Thank you.
I think we covered a lot of it. Mr. Indrawati, do you want to suggest it? Because we were talking about trying to do the skills match, but is that the biggest challenge today, responding to that, the skills match?
It is. And so when you survey many of the company, amazingly with the labor force, the number of young, even university graduate, you also find at the same time the survey who's telling that they are very difficult to find the skill and educated which match with the need of the corporation. So there is definitely a gap between what is actually really needed at the corporate level, especially private sector, with those actually being produced by the education system. So how you are going to change that? First, many of the job is actually a practical, technical job, and that's why what you mentioned about vocational. And Indonesia, just like many others, we learn from the best. That's why Germany come to mind, and many of others who actually very excellent in designing the vocational. Now it's been us or our minister, or in this case, all instructor has been sent to look at how they design those vocational training. Second, really actually inviting the private sector or corporate leaders to become the real active stakeholder on education. Yeah. Usually the education was designed only by the bureaucrat, or now you really have to invite them in the board.
Are they willing? That was a question I wanted to ask earlier. Are they willing to jump in?
It's not going to be immediately in a full-time job, but if you are going to be using the technology, or in this case, it's actually creating more corporate link to the school, it can be done. It really can be done. They actually have a division in terms of linking what is actually the corporate need. At the end, when you talk, and in each of your capital market, you look at the 10 biggest capitalization of the corporation. What is actually what they need in terms of their labor skill that is actually moving up into their ladder of career? That is going to be something that they can, it's not going to be permanent, it's in which they have full time. They can provide more, what you call it, inspiring, as well as designing the system.
And also training programs, I would imagine.
Training program on the job training, I think that is very critical for many of them. Or even in this case, that you are doing the coaching and secondment. Without payment, just like when Minister Simsak, Deputy Prime Minister Simsak, I still remember minister before, so that's why. So
he's a man of many hats.
Well, I know, it's the destiny, you call it. It is actually really like making sure that you have the chance to be in an institution or have the experience, even without payment. In your CV, you are going to be seen that, oh, I've been working in this kind of activity, in this kind of institution, or even better, under this coach, under this person who's known that they are coaching very effectively. That will really a plus point.
Right. It's one of the issues that came up out of the communique, and I think why you asked that question as well. I'm sure you had a big debate at the Youth Summit. You've been very patient in the back. We're glad we got a microphone too.
Yeah, thank you.
And then the gentleman here afterwards.
Yeah, sure. Just not to come back about the fact that it's needed. Actually, it's important to involve the private sector into the education, but more about the privatization and the PPPs. Just a simple question: do you think that privatization of education helps decreasing inequalities, or actually sometimes increase inequalities? I ask the question because I believe that inequalities is an important aspect of. Actually, it's a real problem in empowerment of youth.
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify. The panel was asking the same, because you have to hold the microphone a little bit closer to you. Are you saying about privatization, the danger of privatization? Or does it help the process?
Education.
Of education.
Private education.
Private education, does it reduce inequalities in access to education, for example? So inequalities.
Do you want to tackle that, or the Minister from Burkina Faso? It's a great point, actually, because there's a big debate all the time.
Education is one of the basic public services that governments can't abandon. It has to be, so education, healthcare are key areas where governments have to lead, and they do that. But that doesn't mean that government cannot introduce roles of the private sector, that they can, set up a vocational school and outsource the training to a private sector or a German company or a Singaporean one or so on. It's these public-private models, I think, that will change the quality of the output and doing that. I think other models that have worked well, you obviously have to regulate the entire quality of whether you're a private school, whether you're an NGO school, or whether you are a public school. But to scale up to the numbers, we all know that the majority of the youth go to public schools. If you don't fix the public schools and upgrade their quality, you're going to have, the have and the have-nots. Those who go to private schools will end up having a better chance of getting a better future because it's a much better quality education. And this is the equal opportunity side. You want to elevate the public education to be as good as the private education, so you bridge that gap going forward. And it comes back to the point that was asked about reforming education. It's changing the curricula. It's adding, it's not teaching, learning by rote. It's not doing the traditional way we got educated. It's teaching them the basic concepts, how to think, how to have critical thinking, how to start a business, appreciating everything, arts, music, cultures, and all of that. It's teaching them the soft skills in education. That's, I think, the reform, the revolution, because we can't predict the jobs that are coming out. So if you think you can teach people for those jobs, we're all going to be wrong. By the time they graduate, the whole job market is changed, and it's teaching them those things and how to think and the soft skills and reforming the curricula, changing the way teachers teach, and then making sure that the exams are not, you fail, it's the end of your life. That exams are meant to put people on different tracks. They're psychometric in essence. So it means you're good in this area, so you can go on that track. You should do better in a technical track, and you should do better in in an arts and thinking track. That's the way we need to use the exams, not to use them as, it's the end of your life if you don't pass, and that's it. That's the entire reform that has to come to the education.
I know the Deputy Prime Minister wanted to jump in. Minister does as well. Please go ahead, DPM.
I think allowing some space for private sector education could actually enhance equal opportunities if it is designed well. In the case of Turkey, I mentioned in my speech, we have private sector. Right now, the share is about 9%. We're willing to pay for poor students to go to private school. So we've designed it in a way that we encourage private schools to expand the capacity, and we pay tuition fees for students to private. Same with healthcare. I think, in the case of Turkey, we have a national healthcare service. You have a choice. You can go to private hospital, you can go to state hospital. We pay for both. And that brings about competition, and competition is key to productivity, and productivity is essential. So innovation, productivity is really where prosperity comes in, and bottom line is some competition between private and public sector education or healthcare is actually a good thing for overall well-being of society, in my view, if it is designed well and we have a model which we think is works.
So we hear from both a very populated country like Turkey and one that's less popular like Jordan, but introducing competition within the ranks of education, which is something, again, that the youth are going to have in their communique. Minister, thanks for your patience there. And then we'll take another final question from the floor, unless you're right. You're okay? Good. But let's let the minister ask. She wanted to contribute.
Je crois qu'ils ont déjà répondu à la question de l'éducation, mais le droit à l'éducation, c'est un droit reconnu. La question maintenant, c'est qu'on se rend compte que le secteur public donne une éducation de mauvaise qualité dans la plupart de nos pays. Donc ce sont les gens fortunés qui envoient leurs enfants dans le secteur privé. Alors si le niveau d'enseignement, la qualité de l'enseignement au niveau du public monte à un certain niveau, je pense qu'en ce moment, on pourrait corriger la chose. Mais on n'est pas encore là. Moi, j'ai eu la chance de faire un internat géré par des privés, mais j'ai eu une bourse du gouvernement, puisque cet internat recevait les meilleurs dans les différentes écoles. Naturellement, tout le monde réussit là-bas, mais les moins bons n'ont pas la chance d'avoir un bon encadrement non plus. Donc, je crois que c'est une question vraiment essentielle sur laquelle, effectivement, on doit mettre dans la balance le droit à l'éducation, mais aussi à l'éducation de qualité. C'est ça le point. C'est une question de fond. Je ne pense pas qu'on peut l'épuiser ici.
Just 1 second to add that some of the puzzle is the government's ability to have inspection system to make sure that you can inspect both the public school as well as the private school, that the minimum curricula is really abide to. In some countries, most in the middle income as well as low income country, sometimes you might think that that private school, because it's private, is high quality. Don't always take it for granted.
Great. President Humbo, where are you from originally? Which country?
Je viens du Togo.
Oh, very interesting. You educated where?
Togo, Canada.
University is everywhere.
Togo and Canada.
Oh, my goodness. Togo and Ghana. Very good. He's been very patient. Last question from the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Olatunji. My question is this, and I'm so happy that we have key policymakers on the panel today.
You just have to hold that mic up again. Thank you. Just, there you go.
It's a well-known fact that all around the world, particularly in developing countries, we are having emergence of wealthy elite class in most of our countries, particularly in the developing world. But the sad part is that many of these wealthy elite would rather prefer to put their investments in countries that are well established, other than their own home country. This is actually, to an extent, also contributing to some of the issues that many young people are actually facing in our respective countries. So the case talking about the fact that people are migrating out of some countries in Africa, it's not just about the youth migrating. Also, the elite are also migrating the resources out of those countries, which is also contributing to it. Now, my question is this, that how then do we encourage, under what condition do the elite we get this elite to be committed to reduction in poverty and inequality among young people? That's one. And considering that in our own age, there is more emphasis on the fact that there's a need for more intangible investment, more than the tangible investment, that the conventional type of investment that we know. So what are the things as decision makers, as policy makers, what are the things that you think that would have to be in place for this elite to be able to actually invest in their own countries, more so for young people? Thank you.
Okay. I think Minister Indrawati is probably the best, and then Imad, if you can be
I'll say
quick, because we're right against the last clock. Correct me if I'm wrong. You worked at the World Bank, right?
Yeah,
okay.
CEO.
It's very impressive. That's why I wanted to ask you about that question. Can you address what he's suggesting here? Because there is a lot of capital flight. The money doesn't stay in countries often, and it goes looking for faster growth, perhaps more transparency, perhaps more stability, right? This is always a challenge.
Well, I was finance minister and then moved to World Bank, and then I'm back to Indonesia. In fact, if you ask that question, which is, I think, is a very, very good question in this case. For Indonesia, if you do the survey, many of the abroad educated elite, they actually really want to go back to Indonesia. There is quite special about the Indonesian who's actually attaching emotionally to many of them. But your point is really important. When the elite, and this is exactly what also the observation of some foreigner in Indonesia, if the elite sending all their children abroad, then they don't have the concern about, oh, the education system is bad because my children is not affected. So you're thinking about that the elite have a concern, have stake in the country is very important. Of course, I can answer by saying first, you have to love your country so much that you return back to Indonesia. In my case, I've been asked 100 times, why are you going back to Indonesia instead of staying in the bank with such a very high career and high salary and so on? Because you love the country. It seems like a very cliche, but that's true. You love the country and you want to go back, you want to give the best. The second one is, I think, now that creating an opportunity for you to have a more meaningful contribution, if you can call it that way. And that's the elite, in this case, transparency about why they are actually working, especially in the public sector, as a politician or in a corporation, and really actually creating a much wider, what you call it, attachment to the people. Because what I'm actually a little bit worried in this case, John, in the World Bank, this is the World Bank, and I will taking risk of saying this because then it can be seen. We have a commitment at that time in the World Bank to have a diversified staff. And of course, you recruited from all over the world. But those who's been recruited from all over the world, they are educated all in the elite school globally. So it's not really creating what you call it a diversified thinking. They can be the Ivy League, they can be all the best school in Europe. So you are all having, although the passport different, you can be from Togo, Nigeria, from whatever, Kenya, not many Indonesia in the World Bank, but many other But they actually come and educated, and maybe in this case from the high school or junior school, they've already abroad. So they only like citizen by passport. It's not in terms of the way they think. And this is something that we really need to discuss about the elitism of all the, both education or even institution. I do hope the IDB is not going to be an elite institution, hopefully. But that is going to be something that you really need to self-criticizing. And in the World Bank, this is being discussed quite openly by the board and asking about how you are going to recruit. That's why the young professional recruitment in the World Bank is really trying to come to the country and really recruit it from the graduated, from the country that they produce. That's to create more
different way of
diversified.
thinking, for sure. Final 30 seconds, and then we're going to wrap.
Very quickly, and it relates to the capital. Obviously, capital is like water. It will go to the path of least resistance. Investments and capitals are not charity. And we're in the 21st century, and I think it's impossible people who have the money to tell them, you know, you're going to do this or that. That's up to them what they decide to do with it. And then you have the zakah, and you have all the other tools or philanthropy and so on to deal with that. The key is governments and people holding their governments accountable to that. Are we making the business environment easy? Taxation is a way to redistribute income. Is taxation right? Is the social contract on taxation working? Are people, is there transparency or not? Are we evading taxes or not? Is there corruption or not? These are the issues that will cause money to come in or leave and to have the real opportunities. And that's why at the heart of all of this, it's what are the policymakers making to improve their performance, to making their country transparent, to making business easy to do, to creating the right investment opportunities, equal opportunities, and so on. That's going to drive where the money goes to, and making sure that the government, when there's a market failure or where there isn't enough access to finance, and that we step in and plug these holes and provide the platforms to help those who can't access these issues, and so on.
Okay, thanks very much.
Can
I
I
just want to
just,
check, do we have any housekeeping announcements before we go? Jamil? We're good. Excellent panel. I really appreciate all the questions from the floor. That's pretty wide-ranging, and we'll get the input from the youth as well. Minister, you've been very patient, but I appreciate it because I'm getting the signal to wrap, and in television, that means you got to wrap. It's a nice round of applause to all our participants on the panel and for the questions on the floor. It worked out well, I think, huh? I'll see you later. Nice to see you. You okay?